massive rift detected! It is huge!
Stand down!
We were labeled weak. Watch what happens next. The alien fleet came out of the dark in perfect formation, 50 dreadnoughts arranged in a bristling crown of armor and light, and Fleet Marshal Vrenn Tolask of the Cordovan Compact allowed himself a small, satisfied breath as the sensor plot resolved around the 9th planet of an unremarkable yellow star. 50 ships. 50. He had brought 50 capital-grade dreadnoughts, each one longer than the tallest structure this pitiful species had ever built, each one bristling with graviton lances and antimatter batteries and shield generators drawing enough power to boil an ocean. And he had brought them here, to the edge of a solar system inhabited by a species barely 4 centuries removed from splitting the atom, because the Compact's protocols demanded a minimum show of force for any first correction. The polite bureaucratic term for what came next: submission, confiscation, the forcible folding of a new species into the vast administrative machine of galactic civilization, whether that species liked it or not. Report, Vrenn said, settling into his command throne, the crystalline lattice of his exoskeleton clicking softly against the polished obsidian of the seat. Around him, on the command deck of his flagship, the Adjudicator's Will, 36 officers moved between glowing consoles, their bioluminescent skin patterns flickering blue and gold with the particular calm of veterans who had done this 100 times before across 100 systems. Full sensor sweep complete, Fleet Marshal, reported his tactical officer, a broad-shouldered Kythrani named Asu whose 4 eyes tracked independent data streams with practiced ease. Local system designation Sol, 3rd planet designation Earth is the primary population center, estimated 11 billion sentients. Orbital infrastructure is Asu paused, and something that might have been amusement rippled across his skin patterns. Modest, Fleet Marshal. Chemical and ion propulsion predominant. We are detecting perhaps 200 armed vessels in total, the largest of which masses less than one of our destroyer escorts. As expected, Vrenn said, he had read the intelligence briefings. Humanity, yes, that was the species designation, a clumsy guttural word that his translator matrix rendered without difficulty, had been flagged for first correction after a compact survey drone detected radio emissions decades ago, and more recently, after their expanding colonies at the edge of their small stellar neighborhood had begun to encroach on trade lanes the compact considered its own. Standard procedure. Arrive in overwhelming force, demonstrate the futility of resistance, offer generous terms of surrender, generous being relative, of course, and depart with whatever colonial assets and technological curiosities were deemed useful. It rarely took longer than a single rotation of the system's primary world. Species this young almost always capitulated the moment they understood the scale of what they faced. The few that didn't were corrected more thoroughly, and the footage was distributed to the next candidate species as a courtesy. Fleet Marshal, said his communications officer, a smaller, more delicate Vashtu named Elith whose vocal membranes fluttered with something between duty and boredom. Shall I open a channel to the planetary government? Standard first correction address. Do it, Vrenn said, rising from his throne and straightening the ceremonial sash across his thorax, the one embroidered with the sigils of 41 prior corrections, 41 species folded successfully into the Compact's ledgers. He rather liked this part. Let us see how quickly they fold. The channel opened on the massive viewscreen at the front of the command deck, and for a moment there was only the crackle of a translation matrix struggling against an unfamiliar language architecture. And then a voice, clipped, wary, undeniably human, filled the bridge. This is Colonel Amara Voss, Terran Combined Defense Command. Unidentified fleet, you are inside the orbital boundary of a sovereign system. Identify yourselves and state your intentions. Vrenn allowed himself the pleasure of a long pause before responding, the kind of pause that had, across 41 prior first corrections, done wonders for establishing the appropriate tone. I am Fleet Marshal Vrenn Tolask, representing the Cordovan Compact, custodians of galactic order across 900 systems. Your species has been selected for a first correction. You will submit your colonial assets beyond your home system for administrative transfer, you will accept compact oversight of your technological development, and you will disarm all vessels of war-grade capacity within one planetary rotation. In exchange, your species will be granted provisional membership status within the Compact, with all attendant protections. Resistance is neither advisable nor frankly possible. I have brought 50 dreadnoughts to underscore the seriousness of this offer. I trust I do not need to explain what 50 dreadnoughts can accomplish against. He glanced, almost lazily, at the tactical display, at the scattering of pale blips that represented the sum total of humanity's military hardware, against 200 vessels with the combined mass of one of my destroyers. There was a silence on the other end of the channel. Vrenn had heard this particular silence before, 41 times before, in fact, and he knew its shape. The silence of a species doing the terrible arithmetic of its own helplessness, watching the numbers fail to add up in any way that permitted defiance. It was, he had always thought, almost sad, almost. Fleet Marshal Tolask, Colonel Voss said finally, and there was something in her voice that Vrenn's translation matrix flagged as an anomaly, not fear, not the resigned fury he expected, but something closer to genuine, weary amusement. I'm going to be honest with you. I've been doing this job for 11 years, and I've sat in on exactly 4 first contact briefings that went about the way you'd expect. This isn't going to be the 5th. I beg your pardons. You'll want to hold that thought, Voss said. Actually, hold on, I'm patching you through to someone with a bit more relevant authority. Give it a second. The channel did not close. Instead, the audio feed shifted, background noise changing, and Vrenn felt the first faint prickle of something he had not felt in decades of service, not quite unease, but its distant cousin, the sense of a script deviating from its expected lines. Around him, his bridge crew had gone quiet, watching the display, watching him, waiting for the cue that would tell them how alarmed to be. Asu, Vrenn said quietly, run a deep sensor sweep. All wavelengths. I want to know if there is a single human vessel within this system capable of concerning me, and I want to know it before this conversation continues. Already running, Fleet Marshal, Asu said, 4 eyes flicking across 4 data streams. Confirmed nothing beyond initial assessment, 211 vessels total, human, military, and civilian. Largest confirmed mass approximately 8,000 tons, no exotic energy signatures, no. Asu stopped. Report, Vrenn said, sharper now. Fleet Marshal, I am reading a gravitational anomaly forming at the edge of the system, trans-Neptunian region, consistent with Asu's skin patterns flickered rapid amber, the Kythrani equivalent of a held breath. Consistent with a warp egress signature. A large one, Fleet Marshal, this is larger than anything in our sensor database. I am reading a mass displacement consistent with a single vessel exceeding 12 kilometers in length. The bridge went very, very quiet. That is not possible, Vrenn said, and even as he said it, he watched the tactical display bloom with a spreading corona of exotic particle readings, a boiling knot of gravitational distortion unlike anything the sensor logs of 100 prior corrections had ever recorded. Asu, confirm that reading. A vessel that size would require an antimatter core larger than our entire fleet's combined reactor mass. It would require shield generation technology that confirmed, Fleet Marshal, Asu said, and his voice had lost every trace of its earlier calm. Confirmed, and Fleet Marshal, it is not forming at the edge of the system. The egress point has updated. It is forming inside our formation. That is impossible, Vrenn said again, more quietly this time, because on some level that he would spend the rest of his life trying not to examine too closely. He already understood that it was not. Space itself seemed to flinch. There was no other word for it, no term in Vrenn's considerable vocabulary of galactic phenomena that adequately captured the sensation that rippled through the adjudicator's will as, at the exact geometric center of the Cordovan Compact's 50-ship formation, reality tore open along a seam of white and violet light, and something vast came through. It did not simply appear. It arrived the way a mountain might arrive if mountains could move, an unfolding of impossible mass that seemed to take up more space than the laws of physics ought to permit. Its hull a deep matte black threaded with pulsing veins of blue-white energy. Its silhouette long and predatory and studded with weapon emplacements that dwarfed anything in the Compact's arsenal. 12 kilometers, Asu had said, but as the ship fully resolved on the sensor display, crushing 3 of the Compact's escort destroyers into an emergency evasive scramble simply by existing in the space they had occupied moments before, Vrenn understood that 12 kilometers had been an underestimate. This closed this real the human vessel, and there was no doubt now, no possible alternative explanation. The ident beacon blazing across every Nell in a language his translator rendered almost apologetically was larger than that. 14 kilometers, perhaps 15. A single ship larger than the combined length of his entire fleet laid bow to stern. Designation, Vrenn said, and was faintly, distantly proud that his voice did not shake. I want a designation. Transmitting now, Fleet Marshal, Elith said, her vocal membranes trembling. The vessel identifies itself as the TCS Endeavor's Reach. Terran Combined Defense Command hull classification. She stopped, checked the translation twice. Hull classification Super Dreadnought Prometheus class. Fleet Marshal, there is no prior record of this classification anywhere in Compact archives. This ship does not exist in any database we possess. It exists now, Vrenn said grimly, watching as the massive vessel settled into its position, not fleeing, not maneuvering defensively, simply sitting there dead center in his formation, utterly unbothered like a wolf that had strolled into the middle of a flock of sheep and found the sheep, for reasons it could not quite fathom, standing their ground. Asu, shield status on all vessels. Full shields, Fleet Marshal, as standing order requires in any first contact scenario. Good, weapons free but hold fire. I will not be the Fleet Marshal who started a war over a single vessel, however large, without at least attempting diplomacy first. Vrenn straightened his sash again, forced the tremor out of his 4 hands, and turned to face the view screen as the incoming channel request chimed, not from Colonel Voss this time, but from the impossible ship itself. Open it. The image that resolved on the screen was almost disappointingly ordinary, which somehow made it worse. A command bridge, human in scale and architecture, softly lit, populated by perhaps a dozen crew at consoles who all had the loose, unhurried posture of people executing a plan they had rehearsed 1,000 times and expected to work exactly as rehearsed. And in the command chair, one boot propped with deliberate, insulting casualness on the edge of the console before her, sat a woman with close-cropped gray hair, a face weathered by decades of service, and an expression that Vrenn's translation matrix, after a long processing delay, finally categorized as amusement. Fleet Marshal Vrenn Tolask, the woman said, and her voice carried the easy, unbothered cadence of someone chatting with a neighbor over a fence rather than addressing an alien armada. Captain Elena Reyes, TCS Endeavor's Reach, I hear you've got some paperwork for us to sign. Vrenn's mandibles clicked once, an involuntary gesture of consideration. Captain Reyes, I will credit your species with courage, if nothing else, in producing a vessel of this scale in secret. It changes little. I have 50 dreadnoughts. You have 1 ship, however large. The mathematics of this encounter remain unchanged. See, that's the thing about mathematics, Reyes said, leaning back further in her chair, and somewhere behind her one of her bridge officers made a small sound that might have been a poorly suppressed laugh. It only works if you've got all the numbers. You've got 50 ships, cool, big number, but you don't actually know what one of these does yet, so I'd argue your math homework's incomplete. She tapped a finger against the arm of her chair, thoughtful, almost bored. Let me save us both some time, Fleet Marshal, because I know you people love your protocols and your first contact scripts, and I respect that, I do, but here's ours. You came here to tell 11 billion human beings that they don't get a say in their own future. And I want to be delicate here because I understand you probably mean well by your own lights, that's a pretty stupid thing to have decided to do. You are, I believe, attempting to provoke me, Vrenn said, and beneath the crystalline plates of his exoskeleton, something that was not quite fear but was uncomfortably adjacent to it began to stir. It will not work. I have executed 41 first corrections. I am familiar with bravado. It rarely survives contact with reality. 41, Reyes repeated, and there was something in the way she said it, not mockery exactly, but a kind of weary recognition, the tone of someone reading a very long list of names on a memorial wall. 41 species you've walked in on and told to hand over their kids' future because you brought bigger guns. You know what, Fleet Marshal, I actually don't think you're a bad guy. I think you're a guy who's never once had someone say no and mean it. So let me be the first. She sat forward finally, and the amusement in her face sharpened into something with a great deal more edge to it. No. Vrenn's mandibles clicked twice in rapid succession, the involuntary tell of genuine anger rather than mere consideration. And around him he felt the bridge crew go very still, watching him, waiting to see how a fleet. Marshal, with 41 unbroken victories to his name, absorbed the first outright refusal of his career. Part of him, the older, more cautious part, the part that had climbed to command rank not through recklessness, but through a careful decades-long habit of reading a situation fully before committing to it, noted, distantly, that something about this exchange did not fit the pattern. Species facing first correction did not banter. They did not sound amused. They postured, or they wept, or they raged, but they never, in 41 prior encounters, sounded like a woman mildly irritated by an overdue bill. He filed the observation away and in the end dismissed it, because dismissing it was easier than confronting what it implied, and because 4 decades of unbroken success had taught him that the universe rewarded decisive action over cautious doubt. Then you understand what happens next, Vrenn said, and gave the order before the last word had finished translating, because he had learned across 41 corrections that hesitation in the face of defiance only ever made the eventual violence worse. All batteries target the human vessel. Fire at will. 50 dreadnoughts opened up at once. It was, by any reasonable measure, an apocalyptic amount of firepower, antimatter warheads screaming out on trails of blue-white fire, graviton lances lancing through the void in coordinated volleys designed to overload shields through sheer cumulative energy transfer, particle cannons stitching the darkness with lines of searing light so dense that for one instant the space around the Endeavor's reach looked less like a battlefield and more like the surface of a small, furious sun. It was the kind of barrage that had ended the resistance of 41 prior species within the first 10 seconds of engagement, the kind of overwhelming demonstration that Vrenn had, across the decades, come to think of as almost a formality, a necessary violence performed to make the subsequent peace more durable. The Endeavor's reach did not move. It did not evade, did not raise additional shield harmonics, did not so much as shudder as the combined output of 50 capital ships slammed into its defenses. Instead, a shimmering lattice of translucent blue-gold light bloomed across its hull, not a wall exactly, but something with texture and depth, something that seemed to drink the incoming fire and simply hold it, the antimatter warheads guttering out against the barrier like matches struck against a hurricane, the graviton lances scattering into harmless arcs of dissipating light, the particle cannon fire refracting away in slow, almost lazy spirals that painted the void in colors no compact optics had ever needed a name for. On the bridge of the adjudicator's will, the silence had a texture of its own. Shield integrity, Vrenn said, and this time his voice did shake just slightly, just enough that Asu's 4 eyes flicked toward him for a fraction of a second before returning to the display. Reading full integrity, Fleet Marshal. No degradation at all. Asu's skin patterns had gone the deep mottled gray that Keithrani physiology produced only under genuine bone-deep alarm. Fleet Marshal, we just fired the combined main batteries of 50 dreadnoughts at a single target for 6 full seconds. There is no recorded shield technology in compact history capable of absorbing that output without measurable degradation. None. On the view screen, Captain Reyes hadn't moved from her chair. She'd barely blinked. "You done?" she asked, and there was no triumph in her voice, no cruelty, just a kind of patient, almost gentle inquiry, the tone of a teacher waiting for a student to finish a wrong answer before beginning the correction. "Because I want to be really clear about something, Fleet Marshal, and I need you to actually hear it, not just translate it. That wasn't a warning shot you just fired. That was your entire opening move, your best swing, and it didn't so much as flicker our shields." She let that sit for a moment, let the silence do the work that words couldn't. "Now I'm going to give you exactly one more chance to do this the easy way, because contrary to what you probably think about our species right now, we don't actually enjoy this part. Order your fleet to power down weapons and shields. Surrender the formation. Nobody else needs to get hurt today." "You expect me," Vrenn said, and he could hear the strain in his own translated voice now, the crack running through decades of practiced authority, "to surrender 50 dreadnoughts to a single vessel because it survived one volley." "I expect you," Reyes said, "to do the math I mentioned earlier. You've got 50 ships. I've got one, but Fleet Marshal, and I say this with something like respect because you clearly didn't know what you were walking into, you've only met one of our numbers today. You haven't met the other one yet," she answered almost idly to someone off-screen and nodded. "Weapons-free, Lieutenant Cho, non-lethal doctrine, System 1 deployment. Let's show the Fleet Marshal what we've been building." What happened next would, in the decades that followed, become the single most replayed piece of footage in the recorded history of both the Cordovan Compact and the human species. Studied in military academies and mocked in comedy sketches and analyzed frame by tacticians who never quite managed to fully explain how it had been possible. And it began with a sound, or rather, the absence of one, because the weapon the Endeavor's reach brought to bear produced no visible discharge. No screaming beam of coherent light, no trail of superheated plasma. There was simply, in the space of a single heartbeat, a dreadnought on the eastern flank of the compact formation, the vigilant correction, and then there was a dreadnought whose shields had gone dark, whose weapon batteries had gone silent, whose engines had spun down to idle, all in the same instant, as though some vast unseen hand had simply reached out and turned off a switch that shouldn't have existed. "Report," Vrenn barked, and Asu's voice, when it came, had lost all pretense of professional calm. "The vigilant correction is Fleet Marshal. She's not destroyed. She's not even damaged. Every system is intact but non-functional. It's as though—" Asu stopped, tried again. "It's as though someone reached inside her and disabled her without touching her hull. Shield generators, weapon capacitors, engine cores, all reading 0 output but 0 damage. I don't understand the mechanism. I don't understand how this is possible." "Fleet Marshal," Captain Reyes said, and now, for the first time, there was something almost kind in her voice. The kindness of someone delivering hard news as gently as the news allowed. "That's System 1. Precision energy disruption, calibrated to disable without lethal harm because, and I need you to understand this part especially, we don't actually want to kill your people today. We could. I want to be honest with you, since you've been honest with me about your track record. We could turn this entire formation into debris in under 2 minutes if that's what today required. But it isn't. Today just requires you to understand something that 41 other species apparently never got the chance to learn before you showed up on their doorstep. Humanity isn't the primitive little sideshow you filed us under in your survey logs. We just didn't feel like advertising otherwise until someone forced the issue." Vrenn stared at the display, at the dark and silent hulk of the vigilant correction drifting now at the edge of his formation. 4,000 souls aboard suddenly reduced to helpless passengers in a ship that would not answer them, and felt something colder than he had felt in 4 decades of service settle into the crystalline lattice of his spine. "Explain the technology," he said, because it was the only thing he could think to say, because some deep and stubborn part of him refused to believe there was no explanation, that this could not be reduced to numbers and mechanisms and comprehensible physics. "Explain how this is possible." "I could," Reyes said, "but honestly, Fleet Marshal, I don't think you're in a position where the explanation matters as much as the outcome. Let's keep going. Lieutenant Cho, if you would." And the Endeavor's reach kept going. It moved through the compact formation with a fluid, almost contemptuous grace that no vessel of its scale should have possessed. its engines producing readings that made Asu's four eyes widen with something approaching physical pain every time he glanced at the propulsion telemetry. A drive system that seemed to violate half a dozen principles of reactionless thrust that the Compact's finest engineers had spent centuries insisting were theoretically impossible. It did not charge in a straight line, did not commit to a single vector the way tactical doctrine across 100 species predicted a ship of that mass would be forced to. Instead, it drifted, pivoted, slid sideways through the gaps in the compact formation like something that had already solved the three-dimensional chess problem the battle represented and was simply walking through the solution at its leisure. And everywhere it passed, ships went dark. The merciless Accord, second in the eastern flank, lost power 30 seconds after the vigilant correction, her captain's panicked hails filling the tactical channel with a rising, cracking desperation that Vrenn found he could not bring himself to silence. The Iron Doctrine went next, and then the Silent Verdict, and then two more in such quick succession that Asu's damage control station simply stopped keeping pace with individual reports and began, instead, reciting a running tally in a voice gone flat with disbelief. 7 ships disabled, Fleet Marshal, 8-9. Order the fleet to converge, Vrenn snapped, abandoning in that moment 4 decades of careful doctrine in favor of pure animal instinct, the desperate logic of the surrounded. Concentrate fire on a single point, force it to divide its attention, overwhelm the Fleet Marshal, Reyes interrupted, not unkindly, and on the view screen she had risen from her chair now, standing with her hands loosely clasped behind her back, watching the tactical display with the calm, assessing patience of someone watching a familiar storm roll in exactly as the forecast predicted. I need you to understand that we wargamed this scenario more than 300 times before we ever built this ship. Every formation, every convergence pattern, every desperate all-in gambit your doctrine manuals could theoretically produce. There isn't a configuration of 50 ships in this system that changes today's outcome. I'm not telling you that to be cruel. I'm telling you because I would genuinely rather you stop ordering your crews to die for a math problem you've already lost. 12 ships disabled, Asu reported, his voice barely above a whisper now. 14, Fleet Marshal, the pattern isn't random. She's moving through our formation in a spiral, working outward from the center, and every ship she passes goes dark within seconds. No hull breaches, no casualties reported from any disabled vessel. It's a Fleet Marshal, it's surgical. It's like watching a surgeon rather than a soldier. On the western flank, Subcommander Yesu Prell of the Dreadnought Steadfast Reckoning watched the Endeavors reach drift closer through his own tactical display and made the decision against standing orders, against every doctrine he had ever been drilled on to break formation and run. It was not cowardice, he told himself as his helm officer threw the great ship into as tight a turn as her aging inertial dampeners could manage. It was tactics. A moving target was a harder target. A ship that had already fled the geometric center of the engagement stood a better chance of surviving whatever the human vessel was doing to the ships that stayed still. Full burn, he snapped. Get us clear of the formation now, put distance between us and... The Steadfast Reckoning went dark 40 seconds later, mid-turn, her engines cutting out with the same soundless, bloodless efficiency that had claimed a dozen ships before her. And Subcommander Prell sat in his suddenly silent, powerless command chair and understood, with a clarity that would follow him for the rest of his career, that there had never been a version of this battle in which running changed anything at all. The human ship had not even altered its course to intercept him. It had simply reached out in passing and turned him off, the way one might absently swat a fly without breaking stride. Fleet Marshal, came a new voice over the tactical channel. Ragged with barely restrained panic, Commodore Marshal Vrenn Tolask, commanding the 4 ships of the Northern Picket, ships that had not yet been touched by the human vessel's slow, patient spiral, but that could see with perfect clarity exactly what was coming for them next. Fleet Marshal, request permission to consolidate the Northern Picket into a single defensive envelope, layered shields, concentrated fire on approach vector. Permission granted, Vrenn said, though even as he said it he understood with the same bleak clarity that had begun to settle over the whole of his bridge crew, that permission granted or not, the outcome would not change. 4 ships arranged their overlapping shield envelopes with textbook precision, capacitors feeding power in perfect rotating sequence to maintain a continuous, mutually reinforcing barrier that compact doctrine held to be nearly impenetrable. A formation that had broken the will of 3 separate rebellious client states in Vrenn's own memory. The Endeavor's reach approached the northern picket at an unhurried pace that felt, to every terrified officer watching it come, almost insulting in its lack of urgency. "Captain," said a voice on the human bridge, Lieutenant Cho, whose hands moved across his console with the loose, practiced confidence of a musician playing a piece he had rehearsed 10,000 times. 4 ships, layered shield formation, decent geometry. Actually, that's a textbook overlap pattern. Somebody over there knows what they're doing. "Noted," Reyes said, watching the display without any particular alarm. "Doesn't matter. Take them the same way as the rest. No need to get creative, Lieutenant. We're not trying to impress anybody today. We're trying to end this without anybody dying, and dying is exactly what happens if we start improvising against decent defensive doctrine instead of sticking to what we know works." "Copy that, Captain. Beginning disruption sequence on the northern formation now." It was in the final moments before the northern picket's shields collapsed that Captain Urkesh Domvi, commanding the Dreadnought merciless verdict at the trailing edge of the formation, made the only genuinely unpredictable decision of the entire engagement. He had served under 3 different fleet marshals across a 20-year career defined by cautious, methodical competence, the kind of officer who was never first into a fight and never last out of one. And he watched the slow, mathematical dismantling of 50 ships worth of confidence with a rising, desperate conviction that caution had already failed and that only desperation remained. If the human vessel's weapon could not be outshielded, outmaneuvered, or outthought, then perhaps, he reasoned, in the wild, adrenaline-soaked logic of a man watching his entire fleet go dark around him, it could simply be outmass-ed. A dreadnought was, after all, 800 meters of solid armor and reactor core. Even a ship that could disable weapons and shields with some impossible unseen mechanism could not disable physics itself. "Helm," Domvi said, his voice tight, "bring us to full military thrust, direct intercept course, ramming vector on the human vessel's forward hull. Reactor to emergency overburn. If our weapons cannot touch her, let us see if 800,000 tons of momentum can." His helm officer hesitated only a fraction of a second before complying, and the merciless verdict broke from what remained of the eastern flank in a screaming burn that lit her engines white-hot, closing the gap toward the Endeavor's reach on a trajectory calculated, with cold and genuine mathematical precision, to put her entire prow through the human ship's forward command section. On the bridge of the Endeavor's reach, Lieutenant Cho's console chimed a new alert, and for the first time since the engagement began, something in his voice sharpened into real, immediate urgency. "Captain, I've got a bogey-breaking formation, full burn, ramming trajectory. She's not slowing down. Impact in 90 seconds if we don't respond." "Finally," Reyes said, and there was no fear in the word at all, only a faint, weary note of something almost like approval. "Somebody over there's actually thinking outside the doctrine manual. All right, let's not kill him for trying. Point defense only, minimum force, disable her drive before she reaches ramming distance. And somebody get me a channel to that ship. I want to talk to whoever just decided to try that." The channel opened with barely 30 seconds to spare, and the face that appeared on the auxiliary display was younger than Vrenn's, sharper featured, eyes wide with the particular clarity of a man who had already made peace with dying in the next half-minute. "Captain Reyes," Domvi said, his voice steady despite everything, "Captain Urkesh Domvi, merciless verdict. I intend to put my ship through your hull. I would ask that you not consider it an act of malice. I consider it simply the only card remaining in my hand." "I respect that more than you probably expect me to, Captain Domvi," Reyes said, and there was no mockery in it, only a strange, genuine gravity. "But I'm not going to let you do it, and not because I couldn't survive it, My hull's rated well past anything your reactor could deliver even at full overburn, and I think some part of you already suspects that. I'm going to stop you because I don't want your name added to a very long list of people who died proving a point that didn't need proving. You want to know something? What you just did, breaking off, going for the one option nobody else on your side even considered, that's the most impressive thing anybody on your fleet has done all day. I'd rather you lived to tell people about it than turned into a footnote in a battle report. The merciless verdict's engines died 40 seconds later. Drive core gently. Precisely disabled at a range that left her drifting, powerless but entirely intact. Barely 2,000 meters short of an intercept course that would, had it completed, have accomplished nothing beyond adding one more name to Vrenn Tolask's already catastrophic casualty count of 0. Captain Domvey sat in his suddenly dark and silent bridge, breathing hard, alive in a way he had not expected to be, and found himself, against every instinct 4 decades of compact military culture had drilled into him, profoundly and unexpectedly grateful. Northern picket down, Asu reported, his voice hollowed out now past shock and into something closer to numb arithmetic. 23 ships disabled. The merciless verdict's ramming attempt has failed. She is dead in space, 2,000 meters off intercept, no casualties reported. He looked up from his console, and for the first time in the engagement, his 4 eyes met Vrenn's directly without the deference of rank, one frightened person looking at another. Fleet Marshal, she stopped that ship without destroying it. She could have let it hit. She could have simply allowed a disper. 8 Captain to kill himself and his crew against her hull for no gain at all, and instead she spent resources and attention preventing it. I do not understand a military doctrine that behaves this way. I do not understand an enemy who fights this carefully. Neither do I, Asu, Vrenn said quietly, watching the dark hulk of the merciless verdict drift alongside 24 of her sister ships. Neither do I. The 4-ship envelope held for 11 seconds under an attack that produced no visible beam, no detectable energy discharge that any compact sensor suite could register even in hindsight. And then one after another in a cascading sequence that took perhaps 3 additional seconds to complete, all 4 ships went dark simultaneously, their carefully overlapped shields collapsing not from external pressure, but from what the aftermath analysis would eventually, and with great professional embarrassment, describe as internal systemic disruption of unknown mechanism. A polite way of saying that nobody in the compact's scientific core, then or ever, fully understood how the human weapon actually worked. Only that it did, reliably, precisely, and without fail. Northern picket down, Fleet Marshal, Asu said. 19 ships remaining with power. 18. She has not slowed her approach. She has not deviated from the spiral pattern once since engagement began. Fleet Marshal Vrenn Tolask rose from his throne and walked slowly to the forward viewport of the adjudicator's will. Past consoles gone quiet with a fear his crew had never before been trained to feel, and looked out at the vast dark hull of the human vessel drifting through the wreckage of his confidence, and found himself, for the first time in 4 decades of service, entirely without a plan. "Open the channel again," he said quietly. "I want to speak with her directly, not as Fleet Marshal to Captain, as one commander to another, off the record, if such a thing means anything to your people." "It means something," Reyes said. When the private channel opened a moment later, her voice softer now, stripped of the performative edge it had carried during the opening exchange, something more tired and more human underneath it. "Go ahead, Fleet Marshal." "How many more?" Vrenn asked. "Before you consider the demonstration complete, I ask not as a request for mercy. I ask because I would like to understand the shape of what you consider sufficient." Reyes was quiet for a long moment, watching her own tactical display, watching the neat mathematical progress of her ship's spiral through the compact formation, each disabled vessel logged and confirmed and left drifting, unharmed in its wake. "Honestly, Fleet Marshal, I'd have stopped 20 ships ago if you'd asked me to. This was never about grinding you into the dirt. It was about making sure you understood, all the way down in your bones, that the numbers you walked in here with don't mean what you thought they meant. I think you understand that now. I think you understood it about 10 ships ago, if I'm being honest, and the only reason we're still doing this is that your formation hasn't formally stood down. She paused. So, are you going to give that order, or are we finishing the spiral? It was, Vrenn would reflect many years later, the single most important question anyone had ever asked him. And yet in the moment he found he could not make himself answer it, could not force the word past 4 decades of pride and protocol, and the crushing, humiliating weight of what such a surrender would mean broadcast across every channel his own bridge crew could hear. He closed the private line without a word and gave no order, and told himself the delay was strategy rather than what it plainly was. Vrenn watched, and something inside him that had been forged across 41 campaigns of easy, uncontested victory began, for the first time in his adult life, to genuinely crack. Why, he said, and it was not the voice of a fleet marshal anymore, not really, but something smaller and more honest underneath 4 decades of armor. Why has no survey ever detected this? Why has the Compact never once encountered evidence of technology at this level anywhere in known space? This is not merely advanced, Captain Reyes. This exceeds anything in 900 systems of accumulated data. It should not exist. It should not be possible for a species 4 centuries removed from primitive fission to have built this. Reyes was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, some of the edge had gone out of her voice, replaced by something that sounded disconcertingly almost like sympathy. You want the honest answer, Fleet Marshal. We asked ourselves the same question about you people for a long time. Every survey we ran on the Compact and its neighbors turned up the same thing: big empires, old tech, comfortable tech, tech that had stopped needing to innovate because nobody had seriously challenged you in C. And theories, you conquer, you absorb, you standardize, and standardization is the natural enemy of the kind of desperate, chaotic leaps that actually move a species forward. We, on the other hand, she gestured almost apologetically at the ship around her. We've spent the last 80 years assuming something like you was eventually going to show up on our doorstep with exactly this offer, because that's what history taught us happens to the people who don't see it coming. So we didn't stop innovating. We didn't get comfortable. We built this, another gesture encompassing the entire 15-kilometer bulk of the Endeavor's reach, in secret over decades, specifically for the day some very confident fleet marshal parked his armada in our front yard and told us to hand over our future. That day is today. And I am so sorry it had to be you, Fleet Marshal, but I promise you it was always going to be somebody. 23 ships disabled, Asu said, and his voice had gone past disbelief now into something closer to grief, the tone of a man watching a religion collapse in real time. 26. Fleet Marshal, at this rate she will have disabled the entire formation within. I know the mathematics, Asu, Vrenn said quietly and sank back into his command throne, and for the first time in 41 campaigns felt the full crushing weight of a variable his doctrine had never once accounted for. The possibility that the primitive species on the other end of a first correction might simply, quietly, be lying in wait, patient and terrible for exactly this moment. The Endeavor's reach continued its slow, deliberate spiral through the wreckage of the Compact's confidence, and Captain Elena Reyes watched it happen from her command chair with the calm, unhurried focus of a woman who had spent 30 years training for a single afternoon. And somewhere in the vast, humming heart of her ship, in a data core 3 decks below the bridge, the tactical AI that had been quietly running wargame simulations against this exact scenario for the better part of a decade logged. With a kind of digital satisfaction, that outcome 47 of 312, total Compact capitulation without loss of human life, was tracking almost precisely to prediction. 31, Asu said. 34. Fleet Marshal Vrenn Tolask, Reyes said, and her voice, when it carried across the open channel this time, had lost every trace of its earlier lightness, replaced by something grave and final, the voice of someone closing a door rather than opening one. I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to really think about your answer because I don't think you fully appreciate how much worse this can get if you keep making me demonstrate. Order your remaining ships to power down. Surrender the formation. Your crews will not be harmed. Your vessels will not be destroyed. You have my word, and I promise you, my word is worth considerably more than the terms you offered us 20 minutes ago. Vrenn Tolask, Fleet Marshal of the Cordovan Compact, executor of 41 prior first corrections, sat in the command throne of a flagship surrounded by the darkened hulks of 34 sister vessels, and understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after the panic of the preceding minutes, that there was no version of the following hour that ended with anything other than the words he was about to speak. "Asu," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried across the whole of the silent bridge. "Signal the fleet. All vessels, power down weapons and shields. We are standing down." The word tasted like ash in his translated speech. 41 campaigns of unbroken victory dissolving into a single, unavoidable capitulation. And yet as he watched the Endeavor's reach ease its slow spiral to a halt at the exact geometric center of his broken formation, its massive hull utterly unmarked by 6 seconds of concentrated fleet-scale bombardment, some older and more honest part of him understood that this was not truly a defeat born of cowardice or weakness. It was simply, finally, the universe correcting an assumption the Compact had carried unchallenged for 900 systems and 4 centuries. That overwhelming numbers were the same thing as overwhelming strength, and that a species which had not yet announced itself to the wider galaxy was, by definition, a species that could not yet defend itself. "Standing down confirmed, Fleet Marshal," Asu said, and something in his voice, beneath the shock, beneath the professional shame of total, humiliating defeat, carried a note that Vrenn, in that strange, suspended moment, recognized as something almost like relief. On the view screen, Captain Reyes inclined her head, a small, formal gesture that somehow carried more genuine respect than anything in Vrenn's 41 prior victory ceremonies. "Thank you, Fleet Marshal. I know that wasn't easy. For what it's worth, I mean. And what I said, nobody on your side dies today and nobody on ours particularly wanted them to." Now she settled back into her chair, and the easy, almost conversational tone from the opening of their exchange crept back into her voice, though tempered now, sobered by everything that had happened between. "Let's talk about what actually happens next, because I promise you, Fleet Marshal, this doesn't have to end with either of us feeling like today was a total loss." What followed across the next several hours was a negotiation unlike any Vrenn Tolask had conducted in 4 decades of service, one in which he found himself, for the first time in his career, not dictating terms but receiving them, and receiving them, to his considerable and growing surprise, from a species that showed no interest whatsoever in the kind of punitive humiliation he might have expected, had their positions been reversed. Captain Reyes did not demand the surrender of Compact territory. She did not demand reparations, or tribute, or the kind of grinding administrative subjugation that the Compact itself had inflicted on 41 prior species. She demanded instead 3 things stated plainly and without embellishment: that the Compact formally and permanently withdraw its claim over every human colony and every system within a defined perimeter around Sol, that the 34 disabled vessels be released, unharmed and unmolested, the moment full power returned to them, which her engineers assured Vrenn would occur naturally within 6 hours, no lasting damage done. And that the Cordovan Compact carry word back to its capital, and to every neighboring polity willing to listen, of precisely what had happened here today, not as a threat, but as a simple, factual correction to whatever assumptions the wider galaxy still held about the species it had, until this afternoon, quietly filed away as primitive, harmless, and ripe for the taking. "You could ask for so much more," Vrenn said at one point, several hours into the exchange, his voice carrying a note of genuine, bewildered curiosity that had entirely displaced the fear and fury of the battle's opening minutes. "You have demonstrated capabilities that could reshape the balance of an entire sector. You could demand territory, technology transfer, tribute. Any Compact Fleet Marshal in my position, faced with a defeated rival of this magnitude, would extract every possible advantage from the encounter. Why do you not?" Reyes considered the question for a long moment, and when she answered, there was something almost weary in her voice. The tiredness of someone who had thought about this exact question many, many times in the quiet hours before this day finally arrived. Because we're not trying to become you, Fleet Marshal. We watched what 4 centuries of easy conquest did to the Compact. The complacency, the stagnation, the fact that a species that hasn't had to genuinely fight for anything in generations forgets how to actually earn what it has. We don't want an empire. We want to be left alone to grow into whatever we're going to become, on our own terms, without somebody else's fleet showing up every generation to remind us where we rank in somebody else's hierarchy. So no, I'm not going to strip your territory or your tech or your dignity today. I'm just going to make sure that the next time somebody in this galaxy thinks about doing to us what you tried to do this morning, they remember this conversation first, and they think very, very hard before they try it. And if I refuse even these terms, Vrenn asked, though there was no real defiance left in the question, only the reflexive habit of a man who had spent 40 years never once conceding a negotiation without at least testing its edges. If I return to the Compact and report that a single vessel disabled my fleet and recommend nothing more than that we simply avoid this system in the future, do you imagine that satisfies the Compact's assembly of custodians? They will not accept a report that ends in mere avoidance. They will demand retaliation. A punitive fleet 10 times this size, perhaps more, dispatched not to negotiate but to erase the humiliation entirely. They might try, Reyes said, unbothered. I won't pretend that possibility hasn't occurred to us, Fleet Marshal. It occurred to us about 80 years ago, actually, which is roughly when we started building the next 4 of these. She let that land, watch something flicker across Vrenn's crystalline features that might in a human have been the physical sensation of the floor dropping away. I'm not telling you that to threaten you. I'm telling you because I think it's important you carry the whole picture home with you, not just the part where one ship embarrassed 50. We didn't build the Endeavor's reach as a one-time trick, Fleet Marshal. We built her as a proof of concept. There are 3 more in various stages of construction in ship. Your survey drones never once flagged as anything other than civilian orbital infrastructure, because we've had 80 years to get very, very good at looking harmless. If the Compact sends 10 times this fleet, we send 4 of these, and I promise you, the math doesn't improve for your side just because the numbers get bigger on both ends. Vrenn was quiet for a long moment, processing this, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the last of its formal martial cadence, replaced by something almost conversational, the voice of one professional acknowledging another across a gulf that had, an hour ago, seemed unbridgeable. You have thought about this a great deal longer than a single morning's engagement would suggest. 80 years, Fleet Marshal, give or take. Ever since a very frightened group of scientists ran the numbers on how many advanced, expansionist civilizations statistically had to exist within a few hundred light-years of a species broadcasting radio signals into the void every day for the better part of a century, and realized the honest answer to when will they come was never a question of if. It was only ever a question of when, and what shape we wanted to be standing in when they did. She leaned forward slightly, and something almost gentle crept into her voice, an offering rather than a boast. For what it's worth, Fleet Marshal, I don't think today has to be remembered by your people as the day the Compact was humiliated. I think it can be remembered as the day the Compact learned something true about the size of the universe a little earlier than it would have otherwise, and got to walk away from the lesson intact. That's not nothing. 41 species didn't get that chance from you. I'd like to think we're better than that precedent, on both sides of this conversation, starting today. Vrenn considered this for a long time, the silence stretching comfortably now rather than tensely. 2 commanders who had, somewhere in the preceding hours, stopped speaking as adversaries and started speaking as something closer to colleagues confronting an uncomfortable shared truth. I will carry your terms back to the assembly, he said finally. I will not pretend the reception will be warm. There will be those who call for exactly the retaliation you describe, regardless of the cost. But I will also carry my own account of today, unembellished, and I suspect that account will do more to prevent that retaliation than any threat could. A Fleet Marshal's testimony carries weight in the assembly, Captain Reyes, precisely because Fleet Marshals are not given to exaggeration. When I tell them 50 ships fell to one without a single fatality, and that the one showed mercy at every opportunity it did not require, I think even the most bellicose among the custodians will hesitate before recommending we test that mercy's limits a second time. That's all I'm asking for, Fleet Marshal, Reyes said. A little hesitation. In my experience, that's usually enough to keep people alive long enough to find a better answer than the first one that occurs to them in anger. It was a strange thing, Vrenn reflected later, watching the compact fleet limp home across the long dark weeks of the return journey, 34 dreadnoughts slowly regaining power exactly as promised, not a single life lost across the entire catastrophic engagement, that the defeat which would define the final chapter of his long and once illustrious career felt, in retrospect, less like a humiliation and more like an education, the kind a species received only once. If it was fortunate enough to survive the lesson at all. He had arrived at Sol expecting to add a 40-second entry to a long and comfortable ledger of easy victories. He departed instead having witnessed something that would be discussed, debated, and quietly feared in every command deck and council chamber across 900 systems for generations to come. A species that had spent its brief, obscure history in the galactic dark not cowering, not stagnating, but patiently, quietly, ferociously preparing, all while the wider universe assumed it hadn't yet learned to walk. Word of what had happened at Sol spread through compact space faster than any diplomatic cable could officially travel, past ship to ship, station to station, in the particular hushed, disbelieving tone reserved for events that rewrote the assumptions an entire civilization had built its confidence upon. Within a season, the story had acquired the polished, slightly exaggerated quality of legend, 50 dreadnoughts, one ship, not a single shot that mattered, though Vrenn Tolask, on the rare occasions he was asked to recount it, always insisted the truth needed no exaggeration, that the plain facts of that afternoon were terrifying enough without embellishment. A species 4 centuries removed from splitting the atom had built in secret a vessel that made the Compact's finest capital ships look like antique curiosities. A species the Compact had filed under primitive and harmless had disabled 34 dreadnoughts in under 20 minutes without killing a single soul aboard any of them. A restraint that Vrenn came in later years to understand as perhaps the single most alarming detail of the entire encounter. Not that they could have annihilated his fleet, but that they had chosen with total confidence and total control not to. The Assembly of Custodians convened an emergency session 11 days after Vrenn's return, and the debate that followed would, in later histories, be remembered as the moment the Compact's centuries-long assumption of unchallenged supremacy first cracked in full view of its own governing body. There were, as Vrenn had predicted, voices that called for exactly the retaliation Reyes had warned him of, custodian Balash Orun of the Outer Reaches chief among them, a hardline traditionalist who argued at length that any perceived weakness, however costly to correct, was more dangerous in the long term than the price of correcting it, and who pressed for the immediate mobilization of a punitive fleet numbering in the hundreds. But Vrenn's testimony, delivered without embellishment, and without the defensive posturing the Assembly had half expected from a fleet marshal returning in disgrace, carried a weight that Orun's rhetoric could not overcome. He described the shield that had shrugged off 6 seconds of concentrated fleet fire without so much as a flicker. He described 34 ships disabled without a single hull breach, a restraint that no Compact doctrine manual had a name for because no Compact fleet had ever possessed the luxury of exercising it. He described, most damningly of all, Captain Domvey's ramming attempt, and the deliberate, costly effort the human vessel had expended to prevent a death that would have cost her nothing to allow. We did not lose to superior numbers, Vrenn told the Assembly in words that would be quoted for a generation. We did not even lose to superior technology, though the gap there is real and it is vast. We lost because we arrived assuming a fight and they had already decided 80 years before we knew they existed exactly how that fight would end and precisely how much mercy they intended to show while ending it. I do not know what kind of civilization does that. I know only that it is not one I recommend we test twice. The vote, when it came, authorized no punitive fleet. It authorized instead the establishment of a formal, permanent diplomatic mission to Sol, an unprecedented concession for a compact that had in 900 years never once approached a newly contacted species as an equal rather than a subject. And Fleet Marshal Vrenn Tolask, stripped of his command but spared the disgrace his career's sudden end might otherwise have carried, was offered, and to the considerable surprise of colleagues who had known him for decades, accepted the position of the mission's first-ranking liaison, a role that would occupy the remaining years of his professional life, and one he would later describe, with a candor that surprised even himself, as more meaningful than any of his 41 first corrections had ever been. Captain Elena Reyes returned to Earth orbit that evening to a homeworld that had watched the entire engagement unfold on tactical feeds relayed from a dozen quietly positioned observation platforms. A homeworld that erupted in the hours that followed into a strange and complicated celebration. Relief and pride, and underneath it all, a kind of sober, clear-eyed recognition that the peace they had just won had been purchased not by the ship that arrived that morning, but by 80 years of decisions made by people who had never stopped preparing for a day they hoped, quietly, might never come. She stood on the observation deck of the Endeavor's reach that night, watching the blue curve of Earth turn slowly beneath her. And when her executive officer asked, half in jest, whether she thought the compact would be back, she considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness she'd brought to everything else that day. Maybe, she said. Probably not them, not for a long while. Fleet Marshal Tolask struck me as the type to actually learn a lesson, which is more than I can say for most of the people who have tried this over the centuries if the intel's half right. But somebody else eventually. Somebody always thinks they're the exception. That's just how it goes in every history book I've ever read, human or otherwise. Somebody looks at the quiet ones and decides quiet must mean weak, right up until the day it very obviously doesn't. She was quiet for a moment, watching the slow, patient rotation of the world below, 11 billion people who had gone to sleep the night before as a quiet, unremarkable species at the edge of somebody else's map, and would wake up tomorrow as something else entire. Lie something the rest of the galaxy would now have to reckon with rather than simply catalog. That's fine, she said finally. Let them come, we'll be ready, we've always been ready. Today was just the first time anybody found out. Her executive officer, a broad-shouldered man named Tors who had served with her through the entire secretive, grinding decade of the Endeavor's Reach's construction, allowed himself a small, tired smile. You really think that's the whole story, Captain? Just wait and see. No, Reyes admitted. I think the whole story is a lot longer than either of us will live to see finished. Today's just the first page anybody besides us got to read. She turned from the viewport at last, and something in her weathered, steady face softened into an expression that belonged less to a starship captain and more simply to a woman who had spent 80 years of quiet, unglamorous preparation finally allowed to exhale. But it's a good first page, Tors, I'll take it. Behind her in the vast dark hum of the ship's core, the tactical systems that had spent the day quietly, surgically dismantling the confidence of an interstellar empire settled back into standby, patient and silent waiting, as humanity itself had waited, for 80 years in the dark, unremarked corners of a galaxy that had never once thought to look closely enough to notice what was being built there, for whatever came next.